We will get there. Here we go. Take 453 multiplied by help. All right, here we go. Peace and blessings, family. What's up with all the daydreamers out there? Please live it. Don't sleep through this thing. So we are finally getting to part 2 of our study on tithing. We will be looking specifically at Abraham giving a tithe to Melchizedek. If you have not watched part 1, I encourage you to go back and look at that because everything that we're talking about in this video, also in part 1 of tithing, will be collectively discussed in part 3. So I encourage you to look at that video. As before, all references as far as scriptures will be on the screen, so you can write those things down and go back and look at those things. And I do encourage you to go back and study this for yourself. Please do that. I encourage anybody that watches any video, looks at any commentary, anything, to always go back and weigh it for yourself. I also want to highlight that this video is not, or rather these videos are not about telling you specifically the amount you are supposed to give. We get so caught up in thinking, am I giving the exact right amount, right? That's not what these videos are about. However, this is so that we can make some conclusions, right? One of those conclusions is understanding what the passages that reference anything about tithe are about. Number 2, come to a conclusion regarding that, that magic question: is tithing mandatory for the church today? And then number 3, getting a better understanding on the significance of tithing as a whole, which I believe that once you study 1 and 2, it makes 3 like anyways, side note, as you've probably noticed, I will be reading from my notes in order that I do not go off rambling, as I have a habit of doing, and I actually put that as a habit of doing, just to keep me on track. All right. With that being said, let's dive into the topic of this video: Abraham giving a tithe to Melchizedek. Now, this account is located in Genesis chapter 14. Quick overview. We're not going to read all the scriptures. We'll be here forever. But a quick overview is that these kings, they ended up going to war with each other. One of the kings being the king of Sodom. The soldiers of Sodom were losing the battle. Some fell into a pit while others fled. Because of this, Sodom is plundered and its people are taken captive. Now, along with the people of Sodom, Lot, who happens to be Abraham's nephew, is also taken captive along with his possessions. Word get back to Abraham. He goes to fight to rescue his nephew. Abraham is victorious, bringing back all the possessions, Lot and his possessions, along with the women and other people. Upon return, Abraham is met by Melchizedek, who Abraham then gives a tithe of everything to, and of course, everyone lives happily ever after. All right, let's break down this passage. Now, a couple of things that need to be noted before moving on is that Abraham's only interest in going to fight was because his nephew was taken captive. He was not in this to obtain any type of great gain. We will see more about this later as we continue to unfold this particular passage. Abraham also had help from 3 Amorite brothers, so he did not go at this fight completely alone. He was also met by 2 kings. Now, the interesting thing is, whenever this account of Abraham giving a tithe to Melchizedek is told, it's never brought up about the second king. The only thing we're told about is Melchizedek, but he was approached by 2 kings on his way, right? The 2 kings were the king of Salem, Melchizedek, of course, and the king of Sodom. Now, the king of Salem is both a king and a high priest of the Most High God. It is also recorded that the king of Salem came out bringing bread and wine and also speaking blessings to Abraham. The king of Sodom, however, is recorded as being only a king, not a priest, and there is actually no record of him bringing anything out to Abraham nor giving him any blessings. However, Melchizedek could have been giving the bread and wine and the blessing on behalf of them both, but there's no real clear distinction or indication about this. That probably can go either way. Now, this is why noting that there were 2 kings present in this meeting is necessary. It's important that we understand why this is necessary. You get to see how the 2 kings differ in their approach to Abraham. Not only that, you get to see Abraham's reaction and how it differs to both of the kings, all right? So let's look at Melchizedek first, of course. Melchizedek did not ask, and I want to make sure I highlight this. Melchizedek did not ask, he did not request, he did not demand, nor did he command Abraham give him a tithe of everything. There is nothing written in the passage that actually shows that. Instead of Melchizedek demanding something or instructing something from Abraham, he gives to Abraham, and he also blesses Abraham. Abraham, in turn, gives Melchizedek a tithe of everything. Look at the king of Sodom. Sodom was different. King of Sodom was different. The king of Sodom tells Abraham, note how I'm saying this, tells Abraham to give him the people, but Abraham could keep the possessions for himself. Now, this is the part I love. Abraham's response back to King of Sodom is extremely interesting and is worth noting, right? Abraham says this, that he made an oath to the Most High God that he would not receive anything that belongs to the king of Sodom, not even a thread or a strap of a sandal. Abraham said, look, I made an oath that I'm not going to accept anything from you that belongs to you. And this is so that not even the king of Sodom would be able to say that he made Abraham rich. Remember when I said earlier that Abraham didn't go fight so that he could get some type of increase, a gain? You know, he went to rescue his nephew Lot. That's a shot at your health, wealth, gospel jokers, man. But anyways, however, Abraham did say that the only thing he would accept is the following. And listen to this, what his men had already eaten, and then also let the 3 Amorites who were with him have their share, right? First note, all the things Abraham said he would receive were things that were going to go to the people that were with him, not to Abraham. I think that is an amazing thing to look at. Second note, never does Abraham refuse to give the king of Sodom what belongs to him. So he says, give my men what they've already eaten, give the Amorites their share, and chances are high, he says, the king of Sodom, you can have what is yours. On top of that, he gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything, right? A tenth of everything. Now, we're going to return to all this later, so keep all this in mind so we can continue our study, right? Now that we've had our passage, and we've taken a better look at this passage, let's now consider some theological theories on why Abraham gave the tithe, because that's where you want to be, like, that's where you guys want to be extremely focused. Like, well, get to the tithe, man. All right, let's get to the tithe. So now we're going to look at some theological theories and views on why the tithe was given. Some theologians say that Abraham was actually entitled to either all of the spoils or some of the spoils, or, you know, it's so a theological theory could be that Abraham giving the tithe to Melchizedek was, theoretically speaking, Abraham giving up what would have already belonged to him anyways, right? And giving all that to Melchizedek. The second thing that I saw as I studied this was that it has been stated that Abraham giving a tithe was customary at that time, kind of like a tax was to be paid or even a tribute to those in power, be it a king or even a priest. So again, theoretically speaking, Melchizedek was actually only getting what was customarily his anyways. However, I couldn't really find any real substantial information regarding either of these theories, but again, I will say they are worth studying more into on your own time and even on my own time to see if I can find anything else out. And if I do, I will share it. If you know anything, please share it in the comments or whatever. So, but I will tell you this, I lean towards the view that this is more so customary with the possibility of being tied to the law of the land. And again, I have to do more reference study on that in order to solidify that theory. But there is something I do want us to look at that we can actually see in this passage, and that is, what did Abraham actually give? The reason why this is worth looking at is because the way this passage has often been taught to us or presented gives the impression that Abraham gave the tithe and kept everything else for himself. But looking at the scripture as we already have, we can see that more than likely Abraham kept nothing for himself, or if anything, a very minimum amount. I mean, think on what we've already looked at. Abraham gives a tithe to Melchizedek, allows his men to receive or keep what they have already eaten, and it's worth noting that it was what they have already eaten. Abraham also said to give the portion that was owed to the Amorite brothers who were with him. Then you add the fact that Abraham, because of a vow he made to God, refusing to accept anything from the king of Sodom, more than likely all that was given up too. So with that being stated, it is far more plausible that Abraham gave up everything or really close to it. So again, in our effort to focus on the tithe in a passage of scriptures, we blind ourselves from seeing the full picture of what happens. Think about it. The studying of the tithe in the Mosaic Law, if you go back and look at that, show that Israel didn't just give a tithe, or rather 10% of something, but more than likely they were giving over 20%. And we are talking about mandatory giving by law, right? Reference Tithing Part 1 to see the more information on that. And once again, here we see that while, yes, Abraham gave a tithe to Melchizedek, he also went beyond that and gave more. What can we learn from this principle? What can we learn from this? Principles to know. So again, we've made this passage about ensuring we give the right amount. And doing so, we've missed some very key principles. Number one, if we are to look at this passage solely on giving, it cannot be confined to just giving a tithe. Number two, the passage shows us that the focus was not on what Abraham could gain or increase in a tangible way, but the focus was on others. Some deeper principles upon that we could actually look at. Abraham gave up everything because the only thing that he was really concerned about was rescuing his nephew Lot. Was rescuing his nephew Lot. Now, could it be on that we are seeing what it actually costs in the effort to save a loved one's life? We're getting a picture on what it costs to save a loved one's life. Could this show us that no amount of tangible gain should never replace the benevolent acts of kindness we are to do for others? Could the vow Abraham made show us that we are to keep our word to God regardless of the possibility of gaining any earthly increase? Not only that, can this passage and even the Mosaic Law about tithing teach us the purpose of why we give, which I think is the thing that we miss the most, the reason for it, the use for it, which again places the focus on others rather than on ourselves. The problem is so much of our modern day teaching on tithing and giving is centered around what I can give to God in an effort that he would give back to me, rather than it being what the scripture is showing. It is about the care of others and not just solely about you. I think we've missed that, right? So now we're down to the $1 million question. The $1 million question is, does this passage teach us that tithing is mandatory? Meaning that we can look at Genesis chapter 14 and we can come to a conclusion, walk away, tithing is mandatory for us today. We need to do it. Can we do that? Let me make this clear though. On one side of the table, you have those who say that tithing is no longer mandatory. Because of the bloodshed of Jesus Christ, his sacrifice, we are now freed from the law of Moses. It's no longer binding to us, and that the tithe was for a specific dispensation and time. All right, that is one side of the table. On this side of the table, they say that the tithe is still mandatory simply because it predates the law of Moses. And because it predates the law of Moses, we should follow it continuously even today. There's another argument we're going to look at, but right now let's focus on the predate argument, right? The predate the law of Moses argument. Let's be fair. Yes, they are correct. Abraham gave a tithe to Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14. That's obvious. We studied that. They are correct that Genesis chapter 14 predates the law of Moses. They are correct in that. However, when you look at Genesis chapter 14, there is simply not enough information that is presented that can give us the conclusion that this is a mandatory action for the rest of time. It just does not fit. If anything, we can make it a theological theory, but you cannot make it an actual law or command binded upon Christians today. But to be fair, let's start at Genesis chapter 14 and let's move backwards so that we can see if that kind of conclusion, this theory actually holds up in some shape, form, or fashion. Let's see what we can find. Now, if we go back as far as we can and that the Bible would allow us to, right? We come across, of course, Cain and Abel, the ones that we see who are written first in the action of giving to God. And what we see is gain. Cain gave up his crops, Abel gave up his flocks. Those are bars right there. Abel's was accepted, but Cain's was rejected, all right? Now, some say that God was displeased with Cain's offering because it wasn't a tithe. The problem with this is that, one, there is nothing written regarding instructions about giving prior to Cain and Abel's offering. Number two, when God talked to Cain, there was nothing mentioned about a tithe. Number three, Hebrews tells us that Cain's offering lacked faith and mentions nothing about an amount. So we cannot really use the offering of Cain as a premise on a position of tithing. Then there are other examples in the scriptures that show men paying respect to God by setting up pillars or altars, pouring out drink offerings, but nothing about an amount of anything is actually mentioned until Genesis chapter 14. So again, this whole predate thing is more so of a theory, an assumption that really at this time cannot be backed up with scripture. The best people have done is to tie scriptures together to come up with a possible conclusion, but not necessarily a straightforward answer. So up until Genesis chapter 14, we actually have no account of tithing at all until then. But I want to point something out, guys. If we're going to bring up the predate thing, if we're going to use that, it predates the law of Moses, we have to be cautious of that and using that as an argument to establish the tithe, because then you can say that setting up pillars and stones and pouring out drink offerings and stuff like that on those stones, or however Abraham and all those, the forefathers back in the day, Jacob and all them did, they would set up pillars and stones and stuff like that. All this predates the law of Moses. So if the tithing is also mandatory because it predates, then why not make setting up stone pillars mandatory? Because that also predates the law of Moses. We have to be cautious of that. So there is another argument that we do need to look at, and that is Jesus talked about the tithe argument, right? All right, so because Jesus brought it up, it's mandatory. All right, let's run with it, okay? From a site called thegospelcoalition.org, they have a blog post on there that says that it was affirmed by Jesus as binding on his followers. I'm gonna repeat that again. The site has a blog post on there that says it was affirmed by Jesus as binding on his followers. Let's analyze this argument real quick. Now, they are referring to Jesus when he was talking to the scribes and Pharisees, and he told them that on one hand, they give tithe of mint, rue, and every herb, but lack justice and mercy and even the love of God. He then tells them that they should do the latter without neglecting the other. In other words, do both. Continue to give tithe of mint, rue, and every herb, but start walking in justice, mercy, and the love of God. Now, this is where the argument comes from. It is because Jesus tells them to uphold both that they come up with this idea that Jesus is commanding Christians today to follow giving the tithe. First note, Jesus is talking to scribes and Pharisees who so happen to be what? Israelites, Hebrews, people of that nation. So it is completely understandable for him to bring up the tithe because it was something Israel was specifically commanded by God to do in the law of Moses. They wouldn't be ignorant of this teaching. Again, if you see what the tithe was used for, you will see why both of these things were very important. Again, reference tithing part 1 to see the significance on why these things were important. So yes, we see where Jesus talks about both to the scribes and the Pharisees, but again, they are under the law of Moses. They would understand what Jesus is talking about. But I want to highlight something. Let's really look at some New Testament examples of giving, and it just might blow our mind. This is why I think we need to do more studies from the book of Acts, right? And it's going to blow your mind when you see some things, right? If you look in the book of Acts, the examples of giving that are given, these individuals were selling their property and possessions and distributing amongst each other so that they could have all things in common. Giving to those that actually need it. Think about it, they were selling their possession. Now, the funny thing is, we don't hear nobody talking about this being a commandment in the church, right? We would actually say and push back and say, no, this is an example on how the church is supposed to love each other and treat each other, right? Okay, so now this is an example, but everything else, you're trying to make it a command. But not only that, let's look at some of the things that we quote when it comes to giving from the New Testament, right? Some of these quotes that we give are such as not giving of necessity, God loves the cheerful giver, lay up in stores, God is prosper, what you have purposed in your heart to give. And other scriptures like this from the New Testament are actually centered around a collection that Paul was going around picking up for the church in Jerusalem. It wasn't about anything dealing with tithing. And therein lies a constant theme we see in these passages. We are so caught up on the amount we are to give, or should I say the minimum we are to do. I mean, let's be honest with it, man. That's what we're asking. What's the minimum I need to give in order to be in right standings with God? That we blind ourselves to the overflow of giving done by those in these passages. We see in the law of Moses, they actually gave more than 10%. We've made Genesis chapter 14 about giving 10% when Abraham gave up more than just that. We also see in the church that they didn't focus on the amount, but rather the purpose and intention for what was given. Teachers have made tithing out to be about doing it so you can receive more from God, or they made it out to be this: if you don't do it, you won't be blessed by God. That we miss the principle of the giving, which is to take care of the people physically and spiritually. If there is anything we should get from these passages, it is that when you neglect to give, you neglect the aid of the human beings in your midst. So let me go ahead and wrap this up and say this. Regardless of whether God established the tithe himself, or if he used a custom that was already established, I think that God used the tithe for a greater purpose he had in mind. And in order to see this, we have to shift our focus just a little from just seeing only the tithe in Genesis chapter 14 as the centerpiece of this account, but we also have to see Melchizedek. And that is where we'll pick up on our next study of tithing in part 3. I hope this blessed you. I know this one was a little long, but at the end of the day, guys, man, I really hope that it poured into you. Hope that you learned something. Again, go back, study it, man. Look at it. Whatever your thoughts is, let me know. Much love and respect. Peace.